He thought she was invisible, but he had no idea she was the only one who saw everything. The courtroom felt controlled, almost predictable, as Richard Halston leaned back in his chair, his tailored suit sharp, his confidence even sharper. Every movement around him seemed to orbit his presence. The attorneys spoke carefully, the judge listened with measured patience, and the narrative of the case moved forward exactly as expected. Across the room, Marcus Reed sat quietly at the defense table, his hands still, his expression distant, not from calm but from the quiet weight of a situation that had already begun to close in around him. The prosecution's timeline was clean, precise, and supported by records that left little room for doubt. Every minute accounted for, every movement explained, and as the final arguments began to take shape, it felt as though the outcome had already been decided before it could be spoken. In the far corner near the side entrance, Angela Brooks moved slowly, pushing a cleaning cart along the polished floor, her uniform simple, her presence unnoticed by most of the room. She paused briefly to adjust a small stack of supplies, her eyes lifting just long enough to take in the space around her, not searching, not reacting, just observing, as she had done countless times before in places where people assumed no one was paying attention. The judge called for final confirmations, his voice steady as he reviewed the sequence one last time, and that was when the defense attorney hesitated just slightly before speaking. "Your Honor, there is one additional witness who may provide context regarding the timeline." The words were not dramatic, but they shifted the rhythm of the room just enough for a few heads to turn. Richard Halston's expression changed subtly, not concern, not yet, but irritation, the kind that comes when something unnecessary interrupts a process already under control. "Another witness at this stage," he said quietly, almost to himself, before looking toward the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing briefly at the defense before nodding. "Bring them forward," he said. The movement was small but noticeable as Angela Brooks stepped away from the corner, her hands leaving the cart behind as she walked toward the witness stand, her pace steady, her expression calm, the contrast between her presence and the setting around her impossible to ignore. She did not belong to the structure of the room, and yet she moved through it without hesitation. Richard Halston let out a faint breath, his lips tightening slightly as he watched her approach. "She works here," he said quietly, his tone carrying just enough dismissal to be heard by those closest to him. "Cleaning staff." The words were not loud, but they traveled. The judge looked down at the file, then back at the witness. "State your name," he said. Angela's voice was clear and even. "Angela Brooks." She replied, her eyes steady, not challenging, not uncertain, simply present. The courtroom did not react immediately, but something in the air shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that suggested the rhythm had changed, even if no one could yet explain how. Richard Halston leaned slightly forward, his gaze narrowing as he looked at her, then at the defense attorney. "And what exactly is she expected to contribute?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with impatience. The defense attorney did not respond immediately. Instead he gestured toward Angela. "She was present in the building at the time in question," he said simply. The statement hung in the air longer than expected because it did not challenge the narrative directly. It introduced something else, something quieter, something that did not fit neatly into the structure that had already been built. The judge nodded once. "Proceed," he said, and as Angela placed her hands lightly on the stand, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, the room settled into a silence that felt different from before, not routine, not procedural, but anticipatory, as if something small and precise was about to enter the case, and once it did, nothing would remain as certain as it had been moments ago. The room did not shift all at once, it changed in smaller ways. First a pause that lasted slightly longer than expected, a glance that lingered where it normally would not. Angela Brooks stood at the witness stand, her hands resting lightly against the edge, her posture calm, her expression steady, as if she had already accepted that no one in the room expected much from her. "You said you were present in the building," the judge began, his tone neutral but measured. "Can you specify your location at the time in question?" Angela nodded once, her voice even. "I was assigned to the 9th floor that evening. I cleaned that level every night between 9 and 10 p.m. The prosecutor barely looked up from her notes, her pen continuing to move as if the statement confirmed nothing new, while Richard Halston leaned back slightly, his attention divided between the witness and the clock on the wall, his confidence untouched by what he clearly considered a procedural delay. "And did you observe anything relevant to this case?" the judge asked. Angela paused, not out of hesitation but precision. "Yes, Your Honor, I did," she said. The defense attorney shifted forward slightly, his focus sharpening, while the prosecutor finally lifted her gaze, her expression controlled but faintly alert. "I saw someone enter the restricted hallway at approximately 9:14 p.m. Angela continued, her tone unchanged. The words landed softly but carried further than expected. The judge glanced briefly toward the timeline displayed on the screen, where the sequence of events had been carefully constructed. "That aligns with the record of entry," he said, more to himself than to the room. The prosecutor stepped in quickly. Your Honor, the witness is confirming what has already been established. This does not alter the timeline, she said, her voice steady but edged with impatience. Richard Halston allowed a small breath to escape, almost a quiet laugh, not loud enough to interrupt but clear enough to signal his dismissal. Exactly, he added, his tone light. We already know someone entered at that time. Angela did not react to the comment. She did not shift her posture or change her expression. She simply continued, yes, but the person who entered did not match the description given in the report. The silence that followed was immediate, not dramatic but absolute. The prosecutor's pen stopped moving. The defense attorney straightened fully, now his attention locked on the witness. The judge leaned forward slightly, his earlier neutrality narrowing into focus. Clarify that statement, he said. Angela met his gaze without hesitation. The report describes Mr. Reed as entering alone at 9:14 p.m., she said carefully, but the person I saw was not alone and did not match him. The words did not echo, they settled, and as they did the structure of the case shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Richard Halston's expression tightened just enough to register a change, not alarm, not yet, but something closer to awareness that the direction of the moment was no longer entirely within his control. The prosecutor stepped forward quickly, her voice controlled but sharper now. Witnesses can misinterpret what they see, especially in brief encounters. This does not constitute reliable contradiction, she said, but her tone no longer guided the room, it followed it. Angela remained still, her voice calm. I understand that, but I see the same floors every night. I know who belongs there and who does not, she replied. The judge did not interrupt this time. He simply watched as the quiet presence at the stand began to introduce something that did not fit into the clean structure he had been reviewing moments earlier, and as the silence returned once more it carried a different weight, not uncertainty but the beginning of doubt that had not existed before. The silence did not settle, it sharpened, as if every word now carried more weight than the last. Judge Whitaker remained still, for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Angela Brooks, as though trying to measure not just what she said but how certain she was when she said it. You stated the individual was not alone, he said slowly, his tone controlled but focused. Explain exactly what you observed. Angela nodded once, her posture unchanged, her voice steady. The hallway lights were on and the access door opened at 9:14 p.m. I was at the far end near the service closet, but I could see the reflection on the glass panel beside the door. She paused briefly, not for effect but for precision. I saw two figures enter, not one. The room did not react immediately, but the shift was there, quiet and unmistakable. The prosecutor stepped forward quickly, her expression composed but her voice tighter now. Reflections can distort perception. You cannot reliably identify the number of individuals from a reflected image, she said, attempting to narrow the impact, but the defense attorney was already moving. Your Honor, even if the witness cannot identify faces, the presence of a second individual directly contradicts the current narrative that Mr. Reed acted alone, he said, his tone firm but controlled. The words settled heavily. Kevin Reed lifted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on Angela, not with relief but with focus, as if something long buried was beginning to surface. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his fingers resting against the bench, his earlier ease replaced by deliberate attention. Ms. Brooks, how long did you observe this reflection, he asked. Angela answered without hesitation. Long enough to see the second person step inside before the door closed. It was not a brief glance. I was watching because the hallway is usually empty at that hour. The prosecutor shook her head slightly. Observation does not confirm identity and it does not negate the established timeline, she said, but her words no longer held the same authority they had earlier because the foundation beneath them had begun to shift. Angela did not respond to the argument. She simply continued. The second person was taller and moved differently from Mr. Reed. I noticed because I have seen Mr. Reed before in the building and this did not match him. The courtroom fell still again, this time deeper, more focused. The judge's gaze moved briefly toward the timeline displayed on the screen, the clean sequence now showing the first visible sign of strain. If your account is accurate, then the court must consider that the initial identification may be incomplete, he said quietly, not as a conclusion but as recognition. Richard Halston shifted slightly in his seat, his posture no longer as relaxed as before, his expression tightening in a way that suggested awareness, not yet concern but no longer dismissal. The prosecutor stepped forward again, her voice controlled but edged with urgency. Your Honor, the witness is drawing conclusions beyond her scope. She cannot verify who entered, only what she believes she saw. Angela remained calm, her eyes steady. I am not drawing conclusions, I am stating what I observed and it does not match what has been presented, she replied. The room absorbed that sentence differently, not as defiance but as clarity, and as the silence returned once more it carried a new understanding. Something small had entered the case, something precise, something that did not align, and once introduced it could not be removed because even the simplest contradiction has the power to unravel everything. Built upon it, the courtroom no longer felt balanced. It tilted slightly as if something unseen had shifted beneath the surface, and everyone in the room could feel it even if no one spoke it aloud. Judge Whittaker remained silent for a moment longer, his gaze moving between Angela Brooks and the timeline displayed before him, the clean sequence that had once defined the case now carrying visible tension along its edges. If there were two individuals present, he said slowly, his voice controlled but sharpened by focus, then the assumption that Mr. Reed acted alone must be reconsidered. The statement did not raise voices, it lowered them. The prosecutor's posture stiffened, her composure intact but her certainty no longer absolute. Your Honor, the witness is describing a reflection, not a direct line of sight. This is not sufficient to override documented entry logs and established testimony, she said, but her words no longer carried the same authority they once did because they now stood against a contradiction that had not been accounted for. The defense attorney stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. The entry logs confirm a time, not an identity. If a second individual was present, then the interpretation of those logs changes entirely, he said. The logic settled across the room, not aggressively but decisively. Kevin Reed remained still, but his presence had shifted from passive to present, his eyes fixed on Angela as if recognizing that the smallest detail had begun to open a path that had not existed before. Richard Halston leaned slightly forward now, his earlier ease replaced by a more attentive posture, his gaze narrowing as he watched the exchange, his silence no longer dismissive but measured. As though calculating where this shift might lead, Judge Whittaker turned his attention back to Angela. Ms. Brooks, you mentioned you observed movement through reflection. Did you notice anything else that stood out? He asked. The question carried weight not as a challenge but as necessity. Angela paused briefly, not searching but selecting the detail that mattered most. Yes, Your Honor, she said calmly. The second person used the access panel before entering, not after the first person. The room stilled. Again, the difference subtle but critical. The clerk glanced quickly at the displayed timeline where the access log showed a single entry point at 9:14 p.m. The defense attorney spoke immediately. If the access panel was used prior to the entry of the first visible individual, then the recorded entry may not correspond to the person identified in the report, he said, his voice steady. The prosecutor responded quickly but her tone had shifted. That interpretation assumes the witness's observation is exact and not subject to error, she said, yet even as she spoke the structure of her argument felt less secure because it relied on dismissing a detail that now aligned too precisely with the inconsistency already forming. Angela remained composed, her voice even. I remember because it was unusual. Most people swipe and enter immediately. This time there was a pause as if one person waited for the other. She explained. The explanation did not expand the moment, it clarified it, and in that clarity the case shifted again, not dramatically but undeniably. Judge Whittaker leaned back slowly, his fingers resting against the bench, his expression thoughtful as he considered the implication of sequence rather than just presence. If the order of entry does not align with the recorded access, then the identification tied to that access must be questioned, he said quietly. The statement did not conclude anything, it opened everything, and as the silence returned once more it carried a deeper understanding. The case had not simply encountered doubt, it had encountered structure that no longer held, and once that happens no part of the narrative remains untouched. The courtroom no longer moved with the confidence it once carried. Every second now felt measured, as if the space itself was adjusting to a truth it had not expected to confront. Judge Whittaker remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the timeline as though searching for something that could restore its certainty, but nothing appeared. The alignment had shifted and it would not return. Clerk, isolate the access log sequence and expand the entry data, he said finally, his voice calm but carrying a new weight, one that no longer assumed accuracy but demanded verification. The screen adjusted immediately, the timestamp at 9:14 p.m. now enlarged alongside the access panel activity, revealing a detail that had previously gone unnoticed. A second signal just seconds before the recorded entry. The prosecutor stepped forward quickly, her composure intact but her voice tighter now. That could be a system anomaly or a duplicate scan. It does not necessarily indicate a second authorized entry, she said, attempting to contain the implication before it fully formed, but the defense attorney was already leaning in, his focus sharpened. Or it indicates a second card used before the recorded access which would align with the witness statement, he replied, his tone controlled but precise. The room absorbed the exchange not as argument but as possibility. Kevin Reed sat upright now, his attention fixed on the screen as if watching the structure that had confined him begin to separate piece by piece. Angela Brooks remained at the stand. Her presence unchanged, her role not expanding yet becoming central in a way that could no longer be dismissed. She had not introduced complexity, she had introduced clarity, and that clarity was now exposing what had been overlooked. Judge Whittaker leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting against the bench, his expression thoughtful as he studied the expanded data. If there were 2 signals within that time frame, then the assumption of a single entry must be reconsidered, he said quietly, not as a conclusion but as recognition. The prosecutor opened her mouth to respond but paused briefly, the gap in her argument now visible even before she spoke. There is no confirmation that both signals correspond to separate individuals, she said finally, but her tone had shifted. It no longer guided the room, it followed it. The defense attorney nodded, once his voice steady. There is also no confirmation that they do not, and the burden of certainty no longer rests where it did before. He said, the words settled differently now, not as challenge but as balance, returning to a process that had leaned too far in one direction. Richard Halston shifted again in his seat, his posture no longer relaxed, his gaze fixed on the screen, his earlier dismissal replaced by a quiet calculation, as if trying to determine how much of the structure remained intact and how much had already been lost. Judge Whittaker exhaled slowly, his eyes moving from the screen to Angela, then to the attorneys. Ms. Brooks, you stated there was a pause before entry, he said. Did anything else occur during that moment? Angela nodded slightly, her voice calm but precise. Yes, Your Honor. The first person stepped aside slightly, as if allowing the second person to lead. The detail was subtle, almost ordinary, but within the context of the case it carried significant weight because it suggested not only presence but sequence and intention. The room fell silent again, deeper this time, not uncertain but aware that the narrative had reached a point where it could no longer support itself without contradiction, and as the judge leaned back slightly, his expression settled into something more deliberate. It became clear to everyone present that the case had not simply encountered a discrepancy, it had encountered a structure that no longer aligned with reality, and once that happens no amount of authority can hold it together. The courtroom had fully transformed, now no longer a place moving toward resolution but a space carefully unraveling under the weight of its own assumptions. Judge Whittaker remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the expanded data, as if the truth was no longer something to be argued but something to be uncovered piece by piece. Clerk, isolate the access credentials tied to both signals, he said, his voice calm but firm, no longer requesting clarity but requiring it. The clerk moved quickly, navigating through the system, the screen shifting again as identification data began to populate next to the timestamps. A brief pause followed, not dramatic but heavy, as if the room itself understood that whatever appeared next would not be easily dismissed. The prosecutor stepped forward, her posture controlled but her voice now carrying a trace of urgency. Your Honor, even if 2 signals are present, it does not confirm unauthorized access or misidentification. The system could reflect overlapping credentials or delayed scans, she said, attempting to stabilize the structure before it gave way entirely. But the defense attorney remained focused, his attention fixed on the screen. Or it reflects 2 separate entries which would directly contradict the current claim that Mr. Reed acted alone within that time frame. He replied, his tone measured but unyielding. Kevin Reed sat completely still, his gaze locked on the display as the information finalized. 2 credential identifiers appeared side by side, one matching the defendant, the other unfamiliar, not listed in the original report, not referenced in any testimony. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Richard Halston's expression shifted again, this time more noticeably, his posture straightening as his eyes narrowed slightly at the second identifier, as if recognizing something before anyone else spoke. Judge Whittaker leaned forward slowly, his fingers resting against the bench, his voice quieter now but carrying undeniable weight. There is no record of this second credential in the submitted evidence, he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. The prosecutor hesitated for a brief moment before responding. It may be an administrative oversight or an unrelated access event that coincides with the timeline, she said, but the explanation no longer held the same strength because it now stood against a documented inconsistency. Angela Brooks remained still, her presence unchanged, her role continuing to anchor the shift. Without force, the second person used a different card. I noticed because the panel light flashed twice, not once, she said calmly. The detail was small, almost invisible in any other context, but here it aligned perfectly with the data now displayed, and that alignment carried more weight than any argument. The defense attorney nodded slightly. That observation corresponds directly with the dual signal recorded in the system, he said. The judge did not respond immediately, his gaze moving between the witness, the screen, and the attorneys, as if reconstructing the entire sequence from the beginning, but this time without assumption. If 2 credentials were used and only one was presented to this court, then the integrity of the submitted evidence must be questioned, he said. Finally, the words did not escalate the tension, they defined it. The prosecutor stepped back slightly, her earlier control replaced by careful restraint as the structure she had relied on no longer supported itself. Richard Halston remained silent, his expression composed but tighter now, his earlier dismissal gone, replaced by something far more deliberate, as if calculating not whether the narrative had shifted but how far it would continue to move. The courtroom held that moment without movement, without interruption, because everyone present understood that the case had crossed a threshold where it could no longer return to what it had been, and whatever came next would not simply adjust the outcome, it would redefine the entire foundation upon which it had been built. The silence did not break, it deepened into something heavier, more deliberate, as if the entire courtroom understood that what had just surfaced could not be dismissed or redirected. Judge Whittaker remained still, his gaze fixed on the second credential displayed on the screen, his expression no longer neutral but focused with a clarity that suggested the case had entered a different phase entirely. Clerk, run a trace on the unidentified credential and cross-reference it with authorized personnel records for that evening, he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that signaled the importance of what came next. The clerk moved quickly, the system responding with a series of data fields that began to populate slowly, each line appearing one after another as if revealing something that had been hidden in plain sight. The prosecutor stepped forward again, her posture controlled but her voice now measured with caution. Your Honor, it is important to consider that not all access credentials are tied directly to individuals, some are assigned to departments or temporary usage, she said, but her words no longer shaped the room they followed it. The defense attorney did not respond immediately, he simply watched the screen, his attention fixed as the data continued to resolve. Kevin Reed sat upright, his focus unwavering, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet readiness, as if he understood that the truth was no longer approaching, it was arriving. Angela Brooks remained at the stand, her presence unchanged, her role still quiet yet undeniably central. She had not introduced complexity, she had revealed alignment, and that alignment was now expanding beyond a single detail. Richard Halston did not move at first, his posture composed, but his eyes locked onto the screen as the final line of data appeared. The unidentified credential was not temporary, it was assigned, and the name attached to it did not match any witness testimony submitted to the court. The room held that moment without sound, without movement, as if time itself had paused long enough for the implication to settle. Judge Whittaker leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now but carrying unmistakable authority. This credential is registered to an executive access level, he said. The words did not echo, they landed with precision. The prosecutor's composure shifted subtly, not breaking but tightening, as the framework she had relied upon continued to lose its stability. That does not establish involvement, only presence within the building, she said, but the statement lacked the certainty it once held because presence had already been misrepresented once. The defense attorney spoke calmly, his tone even but firm. If an executive-level credential was used in conjunction with the defendant's entry, then the court must consider the possibility that Mr. Reed was not acting independently within that space, he said. The logic did not escalate the moment it clarified it. Richard Halston's expression changed again, this time more visibly, his earlier dismissal gone, replaced by something far more restrained, as if calculating not just the direction of the case but the consequences of where it was now heading. Judge Whittaker did not look at him immediately, his attention remained on the data before him, as if ensuring that every conclusion drawn from it would hold under scrutiny. Ms. Brooks, you stated the second individual entered first, he said. Angela nodded once, her voice calm. Yes, Your Honor. The other person led and Mr. Reed followed. After a brief pause, the detail aligned perfectly with the sequence now displayed, and that alignment carried more weight than any argument presented so far. The courtroom remained silent, not uncertain but aware that the case had crossed another threshold, one that could not be reversed because the evidence no longer supported a single narrative. And as that realization settled fully into the room, it became clear that what had once been a controlled and predictable proceeding had now become something else entirely, a process no longer driven by assumption but by the quiet undeniable force of truth revealing itself piece by piece. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of argument, it had become a place of realization, each new detail no longer debated but absorbed as part of a structure that was being rebuilt in real time. Judge Whittaker remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the executive credential displayed on the screen, his expression now fully shifted from evaluation to scrutiny. Clerk, expand the credential profile and display access history for the past 48 hours, he said, his voice calm but carrying a precision that allowed no room for assumption. The clerk moved quickly, the system responding as a sequence of entries appeared, each timestamp aligned with specific areas of the building, forming a pattern that had not been presented before. The prosecutor stepped forward, her posture composed but her voice now measured carefully. Your Honor, access history alone does not establish involvement, it only Indicates presence within authorized zones, she said, but the statement no longer guided the room it followed it. The defense attorney remained focused, his eyes scanning the data as it populated. Presence becomes relevant when it aligns with an event that has already been misrepresented, he replied, his tone steady. The words settled with quiet weight. Kevin Reed did not move, but his posture remained upright, his gaze fixed on the screen as if every new line of data was restoring something that had been taken from him piece by piece. Angela Brooks stood at the witness stand, unchanged, her presence still quiet yet now undeniably central. She had not raised her voice, she had not forced the moment, she had simply introduced truth and allowed it to move forward on its own. Judge Whittaker leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing as he followed the sequence of entries. There is repeated access to the restricted hallway prior to the time in question, he said quietly. The statement did not escalate tension, it deepened it. The prosecutor hesitated for a brief moment before responding. Repeated access does not indicate wrongdoing, it may reflect routine activity by authorized personnel, she said, but her tone lacked the firmness it once carried because routine activity had not been disclosed in the original presentation. The defense attorney spoke again, his voice calm but deliberate. Routine activity would have been included in the initial report if it were relevant to the case. Its absence suggests omission, not irrelevance, he said. The logic did not challenge, it clarified, and in that clarification the structure continued to shift. Richard Halston remained silent, but his posture had changed completely, his earlier confidence replaced by a stillness that suggested calculation, his eyes fixed on the screen as if measuring each new detail against what had already been presented and what had been left out. Judge Whittaker turned his attention briefly toward Angela. Ms. Brooks, you stated you observed the sequence directly. Do these additional entries align with what you noticed that evening? He asked. Angela nodded once, her voice calm and precise. Yes, Your Honor, the hallway was not empty before 9:14 p.m. I remember because the cleaning schedule requires that area to remain clear during that time, but it was not. The detail was simple, but it connected directly with the pattern now displayed, and that connection carried more weight than any interpretation. The courtroom remained silent, not uncertain but aware that the narrative had moved beyond correction into reconstruction, and as the judge leaned back slightly, his expression settled into something more deliberate. It became clear to everyone present that the case was no longer about a single moment, it was about a series of moments that had not been fully revealed, and once those moments began to surface, the outcome would not depend on argument, it would depend on truth that had been present all along, waiting for the moment. It could no longer be ignored. The courtroom had crossed a point where nothing could return to what it had been. The structure that once guided every argument now stood exposed, not as false but as incomplete, and that distinction carried more weight than any single piece of evidence. Judge Whittaker remained seated, his posture steady but his focus sharper than before, his attention moving between the access history and the individuals before him, as if recalculating every conclusion that had been formed too early. Clerk, isolate the executive credential movement within the 10-minute window surrounding the recorded entry, he said, his voice calm but precise. The screen shifted again, narrowing the data into a sequence that could no longer be overlooked. Multiple entries appeared leading up to 9:14 p.m., each one aligned with the restricted hallway, each one reinforcing the pattern that had not been presented in the original case. The prosecutor stepped forward, her expression controlled but her voice now carefully measured. Your Honor, these entries may reflect authorized oversight or routine checks by executive personnel. Their presence does not inherently contradict the established case, she said, but the statement no longer held the same authority because the established case itself had begun to unravel. The defense attorney did not interrupt immediately, he allowed the data to settle fully before speaking. The issue is not the presence of executive access, the issue is that it was not disclosed while forming a narrative that depended on a single individual acting alone, he said, his tone steady. The words did not challenge, they clarified, and in that clarification the imbalance became undeniable. Kevin Reed remained still, but his presence had shifted completely, his earlier silence no longer passive but grounded, as if the truth now moving through the courtroom was finally aligning with what he had known all along. Angela Brooks stood at the witness stand, unchanged, her role never expanding beyond observation yet now anchoring the entire direction of the case. She had not introduced anything extraordinary, she had simply refused to overlook what others had ignored. Judge Whittaker leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing as he followed the sequence of entries. There is a consistent pattern of executive access prior to and immediately after the recorded entry associated with the defendant, he said quietly, not as a conclusion but as recognition. The prosecutor hesitated for a brief moment before responding. That pattern does not confirm interaction between the individuals, it only Confirms proximity within the same area, she said, but her words now carried less certainty because proximity had already proven to be more significant than initially presented. The defense attorney spoke again, his voice calm but firm. Proximity becomes relevant when it aligns with an undisclosed presence and a misaligned timeline. The court must consider that the narrative presented does not account for all participants, he said. Richard Halston remained silent, but his posture had changed completely, his earlier control replaced by a stillness that suggested calculation, his gaze fixed on the screen as if measuring not just the data but the consequences of what it implied. Judge Whittaker did not look at him immediately, his attention remained on the sequence as it replayed again and again, revealing the same pattern each time, unchanged, consistent, undeniable. If the narrative excludes relevant presence, then the integrity of the conclusion must be reconsidered, he said finally. The words did not escalate the moment they defined it. The courtroom remained silent, not uncertain but aware that the case had reached a point where continuation under the same assumptions was no longer possible, and as that realization settled into every corner of the room, one truth became clear: the case had not simply been challenged, it had been exposed as incomplete, and once that happens, every conclusion built upon it must be examined again from the beginning. The courtroom no longer waited for clarification, it waited for resolution, but not the kind that followed a straight path. This was something different, something that required the entire structure to be reconsidered from its foundation. Judge Whittaker remained seated, his posture composed but his focus unwavering as he looked over the sequence of data one more time, not searching for confirmation but ensuring that what had been revealed could withstand scrutiny. Counsel, approach, he said quietly, his voice controlled but carrying authority that no longer relied on assumption. The attorneys stepped forward, the prosecutor first, her expression measured but tightened at the edges, while the defense attorney remained steady, his attention fixed on the judge. Kevin Reed stayed seated, his gaze forward, his presence grounded in a way it had not been before, as if the uncertainty that once surrounded him had begun to lift, not because the outcome was clear but because the truth was finally being acknowledged. Angela Brooks remained at the stand, her posture unchanged, her role complete in its simplicity yet still central to everything unfolding. She had not argued, she had not insisted, she had simply stated what she saw and allowed it to stand. The judge leaned slightly forward, his voice lower now but precise. The court has been presented with a timeline that relies on singular presence within a restricted area, yet the evidence now reflects multiple entries and undisclosed access credentials, he said. The words did not echo, they settled firmly. The prosecutor responded carefully, her tone controlled but no longer confident. Your Honor, the presence of additional credentials does not directly implicate any individual in the actions under review, it only introduces variables that require further analysis, she said. The defense attorney did not interrupt immediately, he allowed the statement to settle before speaking, and those variables directly affect the validity of the current claim against Mr. Reed because the narrative presented to this court no longer accounts for all participants involved in that time frame. He replied, the logic did not challenge, it clarified, and in that clarification the direction of the case shifted again. Richard Halston remained silent, his earlier control replaced by a stillness that suggested calculation, his eyes fixed on the judge, now not dismissive, not indifferent but attentive, as if recognizing that the authority he once relied on no longer shaped the outcome. Judge Whittaker nodded slightly, his gaze moving between the attorneys before returning to the record. The court cannot proceed under a framework that omits relevant presence and relies on incomplete identification, he said calmly. The integrity of the case depends on accuracy, and at present that accuracy is no longer established. The statement did not raise tension, it resolved it. The clerk began recording the directive while the room remained still, absorbing the shift not as disruption but as correction. The prosecutor stepped back, her posture composed but restrained, her role no longer driving the narrative but adjusting to it. The defense attorney remained steady, his focus unchanged, as if understanding that what mattered most had already occurred. The case had moved from assumption to examination. Kevin Reed remained seated for a moment longer before exhaling slowly, his posture steady, his presence no longer defined by accusation but by the absence of certainty that had once surrounded him. Angela Brooks stepped back from the stand, her movement quiet, her role complete, yet leaving behind a presence that could not be undone because what she introduced had not been opinion or interpretation, it had been alignment. And as the courtroom settled into a silence that felt final but not complete, it became clear to everyone present that the case would not end as it had been expected to. It would continue, but under a different truth, one that could no longer be shaped by power alone, and whatever came next would not be about defending a narrative, it would be about uncovering everything that had been left unseen until now. The courtroom did not return to motion. Immediately after the judge's statement it held a quiet stillness that felt heavier than any argument that had come before, as if every person present understood that the case had crossed into a place where nothing could be assumed anymore. Judge Whittaker remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting against the bench, his gaze lowered briefly, not in uncertainty but in careful consideration of what now needed to follow. All submitted evidence related to access control and identification will be independently reviewed, he said finally, his voice calm but carrying a firm authority that no longer relied on confidence alone but on responsibility. The clerk began organizing the records with precise movements, each document now treated not as confirmation but as something that required verification. The prosecutor stood still, her posture composed but restrained, her earlier control replaced by a careful awareness that the structure she had built no longer held in the same way. Your Honor, we request the opportunity to supplement the record with additional clarification regarding the executive credential, she said, her tone measured. The judge nodded slightly. You will have that opportunity, but any further submissions must be complete and fully disclosed. This court will not proceed under partial representation of facts, he replied, the words settled with quiet finality. The defense attorney remained steady, his attention forward, his role no longer to challenge but to ensure that what followed remained aligned with the truth that had begun to surface. Kevin Reed sat upright, his presence no longer weighed down by uncertainty, his gaze calm as if recognizing that the process now unfolding would take time but would no longer move in a direction built on assumption. Angela Brooks stood near the side of the courtroom now, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her role no longer active yet her presence still anchored in the space she had shifted. She did not look toward anyone in particular, she simply remained composed as she had from the beginning. Richard Halston remained seated, his posture unchanged but his expression different now, the ease that once defined him replaced by a stillness that suggested calculation, his eyes fixed ahead as if considering not just the evidence but the implications of how it had been presented and what had not been shown. The judge rose slowly from the bench, his robe settling as he looked across the room one final time. This matter will be continued pending full evidentiary review, he said, his voice steady. Until that review is complete, no conclusions will be drawn from the current record. The statement did not echo, it settled deeply. The clerk recorded the directive as the room remained silent, not uncertain but aware that the case had not ended, it had been reset. The attorneys began to gather their materials slowly, their movements measured as if each action now carried more weight than before. Kevin Reed remained seated for a brief moment longer before standing, his posture steady, his expression calm, not in relief but in recognition that what had been overlooked had finally been seen. Angela Brooks turned quietly toward the exit. Her steps unhurried, her presence returning to what it had been before, unnoticed by most yet impossible to forget by those who had witnessed what she had done. She had not changed the system, she had revealed where it needed to correct itself, and as the courtroom gradually emptied, one truth remained clear within the silence that followed. When a narrative is built on incomplete truth, it does not collapse through force, it gives way the moment something real enters the room and refuses to be ignored. The courthouse did not feel the same the next day. The air carried a quiet tension that replaced the certainty that had once defined every movement inside courtroom 12. Judge Whittaker returned to the bench not with the same measured confidence but with a deliberate focus shaped by everything that had surfaced the previous day. The case file now thicker with supplemental records and independent verifications placed carefully before him as if each page carried more weight than the last. The courtroom filled again, but the energy had changed, no longer driven by expectation but by anticipation of what would now be revealed. The clerk began presenting the reviewed findings, her voice steady as she outlined the verified access logs, the previously undisclosed credential activity and the alignment between system data and witness observation, each point reinforcing what had once been questioned but was now confirmed. The prosecutor stood ready, her posture composed but restrained, her role no longer to present a complete narrative but to address the gaps that had been exposed. Your Honor, additional review confirms the presence of an executive-level credential within the restricted hallway during the time in question, she said carefully, her tone measured. The words did not shock the room, they settled into it as confirmation of what had already begun to take shape. The defense attorney remained still, his attention fixed on the judge as if recognizing that the outcome was no longer being argued but recognized. Kevin Reed sat upright, his presence steady, his gaze forward, not searching, not uncertain but grounded in a way that reflected the shift that had occurred. Angela Brooks was not called to the stand again, her role complete, yet her presence remained within every detail now being confirmed because what she had observed had become the foundation for everything that followed. Judge Whittaker listened without interruption, his eyes moving across the documents before him as each verification aligned with the last, forming a sequence that no longer required interpretation. The court has reviewed the supplemental evidence and the independent verification of access records, he said finally, his Voice calm but carrying a clarity that left no room for assumption, the findings confirmed that the original timeline was incomplete and that the presence of an additional individual was not disclosed in the initial presentation of this case. The words did not raise tension, they resolved that. The prosecutor lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat but in acceptance of the correction that had taken place. The defense attorney remained composed, his role fulfilled not through argument but through alignment with what had been uncovered. Richard Halston sat still, his posture controlled but his expression no longer carrying the same certainty, his earlier dismissal now replaced by a quiet awareness that the structure he had relied on had shifted beyond recovery. Judge Whitaker continued, his voice steady. Given these findings, the court cannot sustain the current position against Mr. Reed under the previously established narrative. The statement settled with finality, not dramatic, not loud but complete. The clerk recorded the ruling as the room remained silent, not uncertain but aware that the outcome had not been forced, it had been revealed. Kevin Reed exhaled slowly, his posture steady, his presence no longer defined by accusation but by the restoration of what had been overlooked. Angela Brooks remained absent from the room, yet her impact remained undeniable because what she had done was not to challenge authority but to reveal truth. And as the proceedings concluded with measured clarity, one understanding remained within the quiet that followed. When truth enters a space built on assumption, it does not compete with it, it replaces it entirely. The courtroom emptied, without noise, without celebration, without anything that resembled victory, because what had taken place was not a triumph, it was a correction, and corrections rarely demand attention, they demand understanding. Judge Whitaker remained seated for a moment longer after the final statement had been recorded, his gaze resting on the closed case file before him, not as something completed but as something that had been realigned. His hand moved slowly across the surface of the bench as if acknowledging the weight of what had just been resolved, not through argument, not through power but through the presence of a detail that refused to be overlooked. Richard Halston stood from his seat with measured composure, his posture still controlled but no longer defined by certainty. His eyes did not seek attention, they remained forward as if understanding that what had shifted could not be undone, not by influence, not by position but by the simple fact that truth had been introduced where assumption once stood. He turned and walked toward the exit without hesitation, without comment, his presence no longer commanding the room but leaving it. Kevin Reed remained where he was for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly at his sides, his breathing steady, his expression calm, not in relief but in recognition that what had nearly defined him had instead been corrected. He did not look toward the judge or the attorneys, he simply stood and walked forward, his steps quiet as he moved through the same space that had once held him under judgment, now carrying something different, something restored, something no longer questioned. Outside the courthouse the world continued as it always had. People moved across the steps, conversations carried on, unaware of the exact moment that had changed everything inside and among them. Angela